Kick it off and welcome everybody to the third in our session of God and the Holocaust, investigating historical themes. And I really want to welcome tonight, especially our beloved chair of the Tennessee Holocaust Commission, Rabbi Mark Schiftan. He is the chair of the Holocaust Commission and the son of Holocaust survivors. He served as senior rabbi at the temple in Nashville for 23 years until his retirement in 2022. He received his Bachelor of Arts from San Francisco State University. Hebrew Union College of Los Angeles awarded him his master's in Hebrew letters, and he was ordained at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he earned his Doctor of Divinity. He was named a top 25 pulpit rabbi by Newsweek magazine. And Rabbi Schiftan has long collaborated with Dr. John Roebuck at Belmont University in Nashville, director of the Reverend Charlie Kerb Center for Faith Leadership on interfaith initiatives, including webinars and discussions exploring faith and culture. Their friendship has been instrumental in fostering deeper understanding between Jewish and Christian communities. And so it was with greatest pleasure that I welcome tonight Rabbi Mark Schiftan.
Well, Allison, thank you for the invitation. Let me make sure I can get myself on the screen here. One second. All right, we're good. Okay, thank you. Well, I want to thank Allison for the opportunity to be the final part of this trinity of lectures that we've had over the month of November. And I want to thank Allison publicly for all the good work she has been doing on behalf of the Tennessee Holocaust Commission. She is really instrumental in trying to keep the memory and the lessons of the Holocaust alive for successive generations of Tennesseans. And we all owe her an enormous amount of debt. Tonight, I want to share with you the story of my family and my parents. We're not going to speak so much in an academic sense, but rather about a very personal journey. For Jews, this is the time of year where we are reading our way through the book of Genesis. And just a couple of weeks ago, we read about Abraham, the first member of the Jewish people, who was told by God to leave his household, to leave his homeland, to leave everything he ever knew, and to travel to a new place foreign to him to sustain the survival of his people. I'm going to say in a very similar way, many Jews, including my parents, made similar journeys to places unknown, leaving everything they knew behind them to try and sustain the Jewish people. When I think about my parents' journeys, the words that come to mind are courage, resilience, and buoyancy. The courage to form a new life amidst dire circumstances, the ability to have resilience to endure an unknown and uncertain future, all in a foreign land, and the buoyancy to see the hope and promise of a better day. This journey really focuses on the city of Shanghai, China, which was one of the few remaining open ports to members of the Jewish people late into the rise of Hitler and the rise of the Nazi Party. We estimate that somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 Jews from Germany, from Austria, and from Eastern Europe made their way to Shanghai, where you needed only a visa to leave your country of origin in Europe. You didn't need a visa to enter the city or to remain there as a permanent resident. And so tonight I share with you the story of really how they got there and what they experienced once they were there. Most of this I tell through the eyes of my mother's story. Unfortunately, my father I deceased earlier. I know much less about his journey. My mother grew up in Vienna. She was born in 1912. She was the only child to her two parents. She described her childhood as idyllic. Vienna, you should know, was in many ways the cultural center of Europe. Some estimates have the Jewish population at that time as high as 25% of the city. Vienna was the center of intellectual, academic, cultural life within all of Europe. And she grew up in that environment. Her parents owned two, what we would call sundry shops, and a factory that made cosmetics. Their factory was called Engelweiss Parfumerie. My mother's maiden name was Edith Weiss. And she describes her idyllic days of going from home to school to the store nearby her home after her days at school to work, and then back home. My wife and I had the opportunity a few years ago as guests of the Austrian government to travel to Vienna, and we were able to see her home, the store which housed my parents' business, the school where my mother went. And you had the sense, I don't want to sound idyllic, but you had the sense of a Sound of Music kind of theme there. That kind of an architecture in Vienna. As my mother says, she grew up without a hint of known anti-Semitism. All of that ended between March 11th and March 13th, 1938, when the German army invaded Austria, or as my mother always told me, and which history is corroborated, the Germans didn't just force their way in, they were really welcomed in. In what was called the Anschluss, the closing off of Vienna and Austria, she remembers those days. Her father was taken away to some kind of an internment camp for 2 weeks, a frightening thought to her. She was forced to scrub the floors in the school that she attended. Eventually, her father was released only with the proviso that he would find his way to sell his business, to make his way out of the country with due haste. Apparently, the scene in Vienna was of Jews lining the streets with every consulate where they were heard to hope to have a visa. But what they heard was that there was a Chinese consul. Now, think about this. As foreign to life in Vienna could be, was the Chinese consul in the country it represented. The consul general there was Dr. Feng Shan Ho, and he was known for giving visas to anybody and everyone as quick as he could so that they could buy a train ticket or a boat ticket to escape Vienna. My family left Vienna in 1938. They traveled via train over the Alps to Italy. And I remember my mother telling me the whole train ride up until the Italian border, they were in the fear of their lives. Will they make it? Will they be allowed to cross into Italy? My mother was 17 years old when she left Austria. With three teenagers of my own at one point in my life, I can't imagine what she faced. They made their way over the border. They boarded a ship to Shanghai, and they arrived in Shanghai in 1939. Once they were there, they were greeted by members of the Jewish community, sponsored by what was called the Jewish Agency. And parents, teenage children were separated from their parents initially to go to different barracks. There in the teen barracks, a certain gentleman who became my father noticed and caught the eye of my mother. And as he was settling her into her room, she tells me the story that he brought extra blankets and extra pillows to her. My father left Germany, Eastern Germany, Breslau, which has alternated between Germany and Poland. He left in 1938. His two brothers and his mother were taken by the Nazis. We know that they were taken to what would then become known as Auschwitz. He made it out, and the story he told was that when the Nazis came to their home, the Nazis took his two brothers. They had been dating Aryan women. They took my mother, and my father hid under a dining room table. And the story he told was that a Nazi soldier was in that room, in the dining room, was uh, called out by his supervising military officer. Anyone else here? And the way my father told the story, this Nazi soldier looked at my father, gun pointed at him, and said, Nein, niemand ist zu Haus. No one else is at home. I really don't know how my father made it from there to Shanghai, but there is where he met my mother. Let me say again, these people left the height of European culture, and here they landed in the backwaters of Shanghai, China. Shanghai was a rich city. There was much crime that was sustaining it. There was much free trade, but life there compared to life in Europe is as night compared to day. We have in our home the picture of my parents' marriage. There they stand as bride and groom in the Ohel Moshe Synagogue. That synagogue stands to this day as a museum to the Jews of Shanghai. And many of my congregants traveled there, and they have plaques and computer screens with my parents' names on them among all the other residents. And my congregants took pictures to show me that they were there and that they saw their names. The area of Shanghai in which they lived from 1939 to 1943, 1941 rather, was often called Little Vienna. And here's the thing, in the midst of all this chaos and uncertainty, it was called Little Vienna because there the Jewish community, there it built cafes and restaurants and theaters and places of commerce. And so even in the midst of all that uncertainty, there was a resistance of sorts, meaning people tried to make a normal life, even in the place of gross abnormality. My parents' wedding picture has my mother in a wedding gown, my father in a tuxedo. I have no idea where those things came from. And we have another picture of a small reception of maybe 25 people celebrating their wedding. And again, I share this to you to juxtapose this reality. They are refugees moving from the height of European culture to a wayward province with nothing on their backs. And yet, here, every special and significant moment of life was celebrated and cherished. So, my mother's father began a business. He was able to get a loan or some money sent somehow to him, the equivalent of $400 from relatives still in Austria. And with that, he started in their little apartment, which held 7 people in a one-bedroom apartment. There, he was able to start to get the supplies to make on a small level what they made in their factory: soaps, perfumes, and there were peddlers there that he gave them to sell. And with that, they were able for a while to sustain and earn an income. My mother's best friend, she made in Shanghai. And the way she made her best friend is the friend once came to her apartment to say, I need some more of this wonderful eau de parfum, eau de toilette that you have made. And it was so wonderful. We need to have more. And my mother started to break out laughing. And her soon to be best friend said, "What's so funny?" And my mother said, "We actually make this in the toilet, this eau de toilette. That's what we use to mix this." They were friends in Shanghai and all the way through their time in America as well. All of this began to change as the Japanese army took over more and more portions of China. Hitler encouraged the Japanese to round up and exterminate the Jewish people. The Japanese refused to exterminate those Jews under its supervision, but it did agree to ghettoize them. And so in 1941, they began the ghettoization of the Jewish community. Again, somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 Jews were confined to a 1 mile square area to live. Life continued. My mother, as a teenager and a young bride, filled with that buoyancy, that resilience and courage, said that life continued to go basically okay until 1943, when the Japanese clamped down further restrictions on that ghetto. Food became scarce, water needed to be boiled, and all sorts of the related illnesses, dysentery, malaria, tuberculosis, all of those started to develop in the streets of Shanghai, to the point that in some ways, like Europe in these ghettos, there were people who were just lost their lives in the streets, with people needing to continue on stepping over them and trying to carry out their lives. If you needed to leave the ghetto, if you had commerce to do or what have you, you could do that, but it required a pass from a Japanese officer who was despised and feared. The last name of this officer was Goya. And the reason he was despised and feared is that sometimes, even with that pass, sometimes he would let you go, but sometimes he would mercilessly beat people for no reason at all that could be understood. So from 1943 forward, life got to be very precarious. Eventually, the United States Army, which of course entered the war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, got the edge on the Japanese. They began aerial assaults in the area of Shanghai, and close to the end of the war, on July 17th, 1945, the Allies accidentally bombed the Shanghai ghetto. And my mother remembers this happening. People were wounded, many in the streets were killed. My mother remembers hiding in her little kitchen with a pot over her head and pots over her parents' heads, and they survived this. The irony is that if that bombing had not occurred and those lives would have been saved after all those years, on September 3rd of 1945, the ghetto was liberated by the United States Armed Forces. My mother remembers a knock on the door in the middle of the night of their apartment by the one person in their apartment building who had a radio, that the war was over. And all of a sudden, people were out in the streets dancing and celebrating. Along the way, as I mentioned, the US military had heard that there was this Jewish population somewhere in the Shanghai area. My mother remembers vividly the first sighting of US soldiers in uniforms. The first person to inspect the ghetto from the United States Armed Forces was a man I came to know in San Francisco. His name was Rabbi Alvin Fine. Now you have to picture this. These people have been there for 7 years. They have lived in enormous impoverished conditions. They have been uncertain of their future. Here comes a man sent in because he is a Jew, a chaplain, meant to ascertain the veracity, the validity, if there is a Jewish community. My mother saw this American man in uniform. On his lapel was the insignia of the Jewish chaplains. Think about this. I'm sorry, it makes me emotional. Here, after all these years, she sees the Star of David atop the Ten Commandments on the uniform of the person who was sent in to see that there was a Jewish community there. The war ends in 45. No one really leaves the Shanghai ghetto till 1947. And in the middle of that time, my mother got a job at the American PX for the American soldiers. She she told us the story that even though she was a married woman, she just couldn't take her eyes off of these tall, handsome, well-fed American soldiers who paid each week in US dollars. So she wanted us to know that, but that she was also loyal and faithful to my father, for which I'm grateful. In any case, when it came time to be able to leave the Shanghai ghetto, some members of her family went to Australia, some went to pre-Israel Palestine. Her parents actually got a letter uh, from one of our relatives who survived Auschwitz and who said to my mother's parents, you should come back to Vienna. You can get your business back. You can get your apartment back. And so after all this time in Shanghai, my grandparents, unbelievable to me, were so in love with being Viennese. They went back to Vienna. They begged my mother to go with them. And my mother said, listen, you have a life there, but we, that is, my husband and I, would like to try a life in America. So the challenge was how to get someone who would write an affidavit for them to be guaranteed not to be a burden on the state. My mother had a teenage crush of a boyfriend who had made his way to New York. Somehow she was able to find his address, to write him and say, would you please verify that we will not be a burden? Would you sign that affidavit? Which he did. So my parents in 1947, in June of 1947, left the Shanghai ghetto to arrive in San Francisco, along with dozens of other members of the Shanghai community. Uh, no doubt this whole story played a part in my becoming a rabbi. Um, my sacred privilege is not only to preserve their memory, but to preserve our sense of peoplehood and of faith. I grew up in San Francisco, embedded in a refugee community of families from Shanghai. So you have to picture this. Every summer we went, everybody went to the same vacation spot for 2 weeks. Everybody spoke German in the middle of California. Every holiday weekend, this entire group went to the same set of hotels north of San Francisco. It was really an idyllic world in which to grow up. Uh, I began by stating these three words: courage, resilience, and buoyancy. You know, we meet people in life who, though they live very ordinary lives, do so despite extraordinary circumstances. They rebuild a life and they rebuild it again. I can't imagine how they did it. I can't imagine how any of them lived through being in such a foreign land. But they did. And to me, my mother and father are nothing short of heroes. Before I take some questions and switch to one other topic, I will tell you one um, humorous story from San Francisco. In San Francisco, unless you are foolish, you never buy your produce at a grocery store. You buy your produce at one of the hundreds of produce shops, many of which are run by immigrants, many of which are immigrants from China. My mother was fluent in Chinese by the time she left China, not fluent in an academic sense, fluent in a sense of understanding the street language of Chinese. So my mother loved to go and bargain with the shop owners, and they would talk among one another about what the price really was and how much to ask this crazy lady about what they should ask her to pay. And my mother often interrupted them in Chinese to say she understood what it cost them and she was going to pay this and not a penny more. So there too, that courage, resilience, that buoyancy paid off. I'm going to stop there with any questions, Allison, and then I'll say a couple words about the work I'm doing at Belmont.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rabbi Schiftan. And for anybody who's joining us tonight, please, if you put your questions in the Q&A, we'll go through those and share them with Rabbi Schiftan here in just a moment. I know we've got some folks formulating questions here as they come in. Um, but thank you so much, Rabbi Schiftan, for sharing that testimony. I have had my phone's been binging with comments about how extraordinary your talk has already been. So thank you. But yeah, absolutely. Let's see, our first question and Q&A is coming through. Okay, excellent. This is from Pastor Andrew Abraham in Crossville. It says, "Thank you, Rabbi Schiftan. Wonderful stories. How did your grandparents do back in Vienna?"
My grandparents did very well back in Vienna. They were able to reclaim their factory and their businesses. And the thing of it is that the Jews in Vienna, by and large, experienced no anti-Semitism until Hitler's army entered the country. And what shocked them was the virulent nature of the anti-Semitism then that they experienced from their neighbors. But all that being said, my grandparents loved being in Vienna. And I had the opportunity. My mother, when she traveled to Vienna several times, I my earliest memories are when I was about 3 years old, traveling with my mother to Vienna. I have a couple of vignettes, but I remember my mother telling me later, after her parents died, and she went with her second husband to Vienna to show him everything. And they walked into one of the stores, and the people behind the counter said, "May we help you?" And my mother said, "What was the store before you had it?" And they said, "Well, we have no idea." My mother says, "Well, I can tell you, once upon a time, it was a sundry shop, and my family owned it." And my mother said the blood drained from their faces. As I mentioned, had the opportunity to go to Vienna a few years ago with my wife. I asked the same question in the same store that I said, it's funny, I'm the grandchild of someone who owned this store. The same reaction. And their reaction was, well, we knew nothing about any of that. We had nothing to do with it. I said, that's fair enough. I just want to tell you, I am still here. My family still endures. And it's a testament to my ancestor that I can be back in this same place.
All right, excellent. And I see one from one of our cherished teacher fellows, David Smith, saying, "My daughter-in-law is from Shanghai. Did your parents ever return to China once they left?"
You could have paid them $1 trillion. They would never want to go back. No, it's interesting. It's like when my congregants took those photos of the synagogue in which they were married. For a generation later and removed, it's part of a tour of China, which was closed for so long. But my parents never ever wanted to go back.
All right, and this makes me happy to say that I see a question from my professor from Virginia Tech, from Richard Hirsch, asking, "My aunt from Vienna told a similar story about being forced to scrub the pavement outside of an Aryan-owned business." So I'm wondering if how that must have been a fairly common theme,
Yeah,
common
it was it
experience.
was it was known that once the Nazis entered to humiliate the Jewish community, the women were given this kind of work. Some of them meant to scrub the sidewalk with toothbrushes, and they were jeered at by their Austrian neighbors. So you can imagine the disbelief that these people who they literally had lived next door to for decades peacefully were jeering at them as they did these menial tasks.
And then Pastor Ray Chandler is asking or saying, "Thank you for the remarkable story. What did your mother and father, as well as other Jews, have to say in order to prove they would not be a burden in the United States?"
What you had to do is you had to get an American citizen to vouch for you that they were going to make sure that you were not a burden on the state, that they were going to do whatever it took, if necessary, to house you, to subsidize you. And that was the thing. My mother and father had no one in the United States except this childhood sweetheart. My mother called him her first love. And so, out of the goodness of his heart, and of course, his willingness as a Jew who was able to enter America ahead of them, was willing to do that. It really, I mean, all of these lives that are saved turned on a dime. I should say the Jews of Shanghai had no idea how devastated the European Jewish community was when they left. If you talk about a sucker punch, it's enduring what they endured, celebrating being set free, only to learn of the death of 6 million people. And of course, many of the members of their family as well.
And we have Karen Johnson asking, "Do you know anything more about your father's family?"
We have tried. I have at home a pocket watch that was my father's watch. We have a photograph of my father's mother, but unfortunately, he passed away when I was 16 on the cusp of 17. I never had the opportunity to ask him those questions. And frankly, even my mother, who lived till 96 and a half, now that I am older, I have additional questions I wish I could have asked her.
And Richard Hirsch is also asking, have you or other family members been able to take advantage of the Austrian law that allows descendants who have left to obtain Austrian passports?
Funny you should ask. Um, I had the option to apply for either Austrian or German citizenship. And I decided to apply for Austrian citizenship because the Austrians were, as my mother used to say, they were greater Nazis than the Nazis of Germany were. So I felt like I wanted to say, we are still here and I am still here. So this is a very cumbersome process. I put in my paperwork in June. They say that it takes at least 18 months till you hear back, but the answer is yes. I have applied for citizenship because I think it's another way of saying you tried to destroy us. I am still here. When I had the chance to go to Vienna, one of the things I did was go to the cemetery there, and my grandfather is buried there. And my grandmother came to America after her husband died. But my grandfather, I wanted to stand at that grave to say, you know, I am still here generations later. So it's a very good question. There are a lot of Jews and a lot of Israelis who are applying for those passport opportunities.
And I'm actually going to interject just for a moment, Rabbi Schiftan, and ask because I've had the privilege to see your mother's testimony that you've shared with me, the recording of it. And I'd wondered if that is something that audience members can access through Shoah Foundation, or if it's one of the others, if it's available to online, or if there's any way that they could get a hold of that.
You should be able to get it through the Shoah Foundation, but Allison, this is something that I need to transfer from a video and a disc to, I don't even know what the word is, what you stick into the side of the computer, a zip drive, something like that. I need to transfer it, and it might be something we can show at some point. It's pretty powerful testimony.
Absolutely. And our teacher fellow, a beloved teacher fellow, Noel Smith is asking, were your parents religious? If yes, how was their faith maintained after these events?
That is a fantastic question. My mother's side of the family was very religious. Um, they did bend to the realities of the open society. So, in other words, their businesses were open on Saturday. My grandfather went to work on Saturday. They had a kosher home, but they were very traditional in their practices. My mother had it's funny, despite everything that happened, she was one of these people that she believed that God saved them for a reason. She was incredibly devout, she and her parents, for as long as she lived. And Vienna was on the border of Eastern Europe, right at the edge. So they were much more traditional. My father was a typical emancipated German Jew. He was religious in the sense of committed to who he was. He honored my mother's traditions, but he was like many German Jews who, given the opportunity to enter the general society, did so. But my synagogue was made up of this entire refugee community. And that too is amazing to think that these folks, despite all that they witnessed, took great comfort in a place where they had to also question their belief at the same time they were in the place where they were validating that belief. That's a really good question. They're all good questions. And Allison, I'm amazed that you know personally everyone who is asking the questions.
I'm working on it. I can't promise that I do, but I'm working on it. And thank you to everybody who's putting questions into the chat. I appreciate you all. So, and we have an excellent one from Pastor Andrew. And I'm really interested in your response to this too, because I think it's a very powerful question. What have the th last 13 months been like for you?
Boy, Pastor, that is a really moving question. Uh, you know, uh, I think, let me say this. I think that for many Southern Jews who have been in the South for four, five, now six generations, this wave of anti-Semitism, both in Israel, in Europe, and at home, is something that they have never felt to this degree in their lifetime. I remember my mother telling me always, um, don't get too comfortable. And I remember as a kid always saying, what are you talking about? Being, very dismissive of that. I hear her voice in my ear now often. And, one of the things you grew up with, if you were the child of refugees or survivors, is the same practice we have now. We have always had active passports for us, and when our children were younger, for them. We've always had some degree of uh, resources at home in case we needed to have the need to buy whatever it might be, a visa or food or what have you. I think, Pastor, we are seeing the reality of Jewish history. And I'm a very optimistic person by nature. I believe in the goodness of the human spirit, but I'm also aware of the realities of Jewish history. And that tells me that Jews have had the privilege for certain amounts of time to live in certain countries in relative security and freedom. But in no place in the history of the world have Jews had that ability to live in freedom for an extended, limitless period of time. So I think to your question, I hear the echoes of my parents' voices in my ears and my grandparents' voices. And I can see the way in which clouds can form to bring similar storms as befell the Jewish people beforehand. I will say one of the major differences in this country is that law enforcement is actually on the side of the Jewish people, as opposed to other places and times where the opposite held true. But I think we're living in some very unsettling times if you're a member of the Jewish people. I could give a whole hour sermon on that, Pastor, but I'm going to refrain from that.
All right. On that note, we've got Noelle and Karen who are asking similar questions about when you first became aware of your parents' stories and when they first shared their testimonies, and how did that affect you?
I think, there's some things that you learn by osmosis and others by the actual stories. I think one of the things that I mentioned to the pastor's question, you always grew up with the sense of um, that life was basically, let me say it this way. The classic, if you remember the days of the telegram, Allison and Maureen, you were too young, but in the days of the telegram, every word mattered, right? You paid for every word. And the classic Jewish telegram read as follows: start worrying, details to follow. And that is the lens that I think my parents viewed much of their lives. That is to say, enjoying the moment, being filled with gratitude for the gifts of each day, but always aware that things could turn on a dime. Later, I would say from the time I was 8, 9, 10, I began to hear the stories of what happened to them, uh, both in Germany and in Shanghai. And of course, particularly with my mother, as I got older, I learned more from her about what happened. The question is really good because, as you know, many of the survivors or the people who were able to flee as refugees, they did not want to share their stories, period, let alone with their children. That's why I say that even though I didn't hear them till later, you had the sense that it came out from the side. They read the newspaper in a way differently than people who were settled here. They paid attention to certain things in a way that was different.
Okay, and then Greg Williams has asked or said, my mother's family also lived in the ghetto after fleeing Munich in late 1939, and she was born in Shanghai in early 1940. She often wonders how families in similar circumstances manage to hold on to hope and foster community amidst the difficulties. Did your family form any meaningful connections with other refugees or locals during their time in Shanghai, and are there stories of resilience or solidarity that stand out to you?
I think they made some lifelong friends there that transferred over to San Francisco as well. And that's what I was trying to describe. I grew up with German being spoken as a first language all around me. Um, the food that was prepared whenever we went to someone's house. I remember when it came time to my mother, she told me the story that it was the time for their first Thanksgiving in America. And her best friend, who I described in the story, said, well, what are you doing for Thanksgiving? We're inviting so and so. My my mother thought that Thanksgiving was a purely Christian holiday, and she got so angry at her best friend she hung up the phone on her for celebrating Thanksgiving as a member of the Jewish community. So the answer is I grew up in this bubble of this sort of German, Austrian, mix of people. And it was such an incredibly secure and loving bubble. And I've understood where I live now in Nashville, while it was a much smaller community of 7 or 8 families, the same kind of thing happened. I'm sure it happens with every immigrant group, but this group could empathize with one another about what they experienced. I should also say that in that same community, were several members of that community that had the tattooed numbers on their forearms as well, who weren't as lucky as my parents were.
This is an excellent question. It says, Rabbi Schiftan, what is the greatest lesson you've learned from the Shoah via your parents and grandparents that you could share with the Jewish students at Belmont and to encourage them?
I would say that I'm going to give, because I'm a rabbi, I have to give more than one answer here. I hope it's okay. I think the one is never forget where you came from, never forget who you are, to whom you belong, and before whom you stand, and that for which you stand. That's like one lesson. But the other lesson is the lesson that my mother taught me, which is to be grateful for the gift not only of every day, but to each moment in every day, and to view the cup of life as never half empty, never half full, but overflowing. My friend at Belmont says that life and life's experiences can either make you bitter or they can make you better. And I love that imagery, that terminology, because if any of these people would have been made bitter and disheartened by their experiences, they could and should be forgiven. But I was lucky to have parents, and a mother in particular, and a grandmother in particular, that said life is so uncertain, life is hard, and life is harsh. our obligation is to cherish those moments of joy, those opportunities for love, and to be grateful for every one of them. Those are the lessons.
Wow, you've got me sort of fixed on that one. So I'm gonna be chewing on that the rest of the night. Thank you. We've got teacher fellow Tracy Reese who says, you've mentioned that your parents' story has impacted your decision to become a rabbi. How old were you when you knew this would be your path? Have you ever thought about doing something else or taking a different path with your life to show that you're still, quote, still here?
An excellent question that we don't have an hour for or a therapist to analyze it with. Uh, I started to think about being a rabbi when I was probably 12, 13, or 14. And there were probably a lot of confluences that led to that. Certainly, one of them was my parents' story. I think another was, um, like many Jewish children of Jewish immigrants, the person they saw who was a white collar professional was their public school teacher, right? That was the job that they admired and they wanted to emulate. And I love the idea of teaching Jewish values in a variety of settings, speaking about them, teaching, being an ambassador to the non Jewish community. That all stuck. My mother prayed to God that I would become a lawyer. The last thing she wanted was this image from the old country of a rabbi, basically begging for, uh, in Yiddish, parnasa, begging to eke out a livelihood. She didn't know that rabbi in Americas have 401ks and, have offices and staffs to work with them. Eventually, when I told her this is what I want to do, she was happy for me and then proud of me. And my friend tells a similar story that there could be 1,000 people in the congregation on the high holy days. I was interested only in two, my mother and father, and what they thought about what I was doing. So it's a very good question. Um, I'm sure that part of my passion for social justice comes out of the same arena. And if I weren't a rabbi, I would be as committed as a Jew working for human rights and civil liberties.
Uh, Pastor Ray is asking, what do you think the reason that the Japanese refused to execute the Jewish community was? Though the ghettoization was terrible, it is astonishing that the Jewish people were given a chance to survive.
It's really interesting. The Japanese were merciless when it came to the treatment and slaughter of their enemies, but they held a certain place for innocent civilians. And I should say, they were merciless to the Chinese civilians as well. For some reason, for the Jews, they didn't have that same antipathy. And they didn't, I think the idea for them of organized slaughter, not random harassment or execution, was, it's weird to say, but was an anathema to them. It's really, and I only know so much. I'm not a scholar of this period. I'm able to piece together certain facts, but I don't know enough about the Japanese ethos at that time to really know for certain.
And then Brad is asking, as a Presbyterian pastor, how can we best help going forward?
I think that we live in an extraordinary time, and maybe this is a good, final segue. My work at Belmont University, a Christian, historically Christian university. I'm the first rabbi to work at Belmont University in 140 years. Can you imagine a rabbi on the payroll? It's not much, but on the payroll of a Christian university in the deep South is really unheard of. But we live in extraordinary times in which there are segments, and they are broad segments of the Christian community is at last open to understanding that they strengthen their Christianity when they study their Jewish roots. Jesus lived as a Jew proudly. He died as a Jew. And we live in a time now and in an extraordinary place where Christians feel like they can strengthen their faith by learning more about the Jewish faith. And so, what does that translate into? It translates into not just love your neighbor, love your Jewish neighbor, because you are a descendant of that same family tree. And I would say, in return, part of my challenge with the Jewish community is to say, we've been uncomfortable saying, can we learn anything from this Jew named Jesus? And if so, can it strengthen who we are in relation to our Christian neighbors? So it's a two-way street, but that's certainly what Christians and Christian churches can do.
Excellent. And then our buddy Ken has asked, have any of your other rel did any of your other relatives survive on either your mother or father's side?
Yeah. My on my father's side, we know that some relatives survived and made it to safe harbors in Guatemala and Honduras. And I was able to meet them. Um, but, this is one of the sad things, and it's pre-internet. In my father's lifetime, he could not find anything out about his brothers and his mother. His father had since passed away before the war began. My mother had cousins that made their way to Israel. There's a beautiful family there, Australia, and there were some relatives that came with them to San Francisco as well as those who went back to Vienna. But, when you look at some of these family photos and you see these summer gatherings of dozens of people, that's when you feel a real sense of longing and loss because they were completely wiped out. One of the toughest things when you're a rabbi is to perform these life cycle ceremonies. And you see some weddings or bar mitzvahs where there are, like I mentioned, five, six generations of families intact. And professionally, I have a job to do. Personally, I look with a bit of longing as what must that be like? That's a good question, Ken. And let me just say that Ken is on par with Allison, is a wonderful, devoted, dedicated, and talented gift to our Tennessee Holocaust Commission.
I would agree with that, Rabbi Schiftan. And I want to ask if anybody's got last minute questions. I know we're at 8 o'clock in Knoxville, but certainly let us know. And Rabbi Schiftan, I'm going to defer it to you, sir, to kind of wrap it up for us. And if you've got any sort of concluding message for us, we'd welcome it.
Well, first of all, Allison, thank you for the invitation. And I do hope that it's still very emotional to me. And I hope it was cogent and coherent and meaningful to others as well. I think I am passionate about where life has led me to this point today. My work at Belmont, where I am educating students and faculty, Christian clergy, and members of the greater community, um, is at the end of the day a message and a calling of hope. And that's really for all of us, is to remind ourselves. I remind my people all the time, despite the circumstances we live in this country, um, if I look at my parents' journey, if I look at the Jewish journey, that cultural Jewish DNA, as I call it, that resilience, that courage, that optimism and buoyancy, um, that's what has allowed us not only to survive but to thrive. And I would suggest that to everyone. There's a message there. Um, you can get through amazingly difficult times. The challenge then is to come out still caring to better the lives of others. to be better and not bitter. Now, in my, I will, let me just say one other thing. In my former life as the pulpit rabbi, that would have been a 40-minute sermon, what I said in 2 minutes. So you're never too old to improve either.
Rabbi Schiftan, thank you so much, sir, for joining us tonight. And thank you to everybody who's been with us tonight and with the past couple of weeks. Thank you so much. We appreciate you all. And please reach out if you've got questions. Everybody have a great night.
Thank you.